3.5 years after the Grenfell Tower fire, there are still about 700,000 people living in high-rise blocks with flammable cladding. The problem is not just that the buildings are unsafe, but many of those living there are trapped, unable to pay for the necessary improvements, nor move because their homes are unsellable, unmortgageable and uninsurable. Well, just before we came on air, the Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, announced what he called an unprecedented intervention to try to deal with the problem.
I am therefore, today, making an exceptional intervention on behalf of the government and providing certainty that leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings will face no cost for cladding remediation works. We will make further funding available to pay for the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding for all leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings of 18 metres and above, or above 6 stories in England.
There was also an announcement for those leaseholders in low and medium-rise blocks.
The government will develop a long-term scheme to protect leaseholders in this situation with financial support for cladding remediation on buildings between 4 and 6 stories. Under a long-term low-interest scheme, no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 a month towards the removal of unsafe cladding, many far less.
Well, Chris Cook is an editor at Tortoise Media and former policy editor for the BBC's Newsnight. He's been following the story since the Grenfell Tower fire took place in 2017. Chris, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, just to be clear, first of all, does this money cover all nations? Is that what we're referring to here?
That is a good question.
Oh.
I can't.
Let's see what we can find out about that, and let's move on, because there are lots of questions attached to this. We played just 2, and I'll see if we can answer it separately. We played just 2 of the clips there from his announcement, which referred to the above 6 stories, 4 to 6 stories. Does it solve the problem for those who are living in a block above 6 stories?
No, not really. There are 2 big things, I think, problematic things here with this plan. The first is, as you say, there's £3.5 billion of remediation money for people in these in taller buildings, and I mean it's slightly ridiculous to have someone whose house is deemed worthy of sort of basically free public support to fix and make fire safe based on the height of the highest flat in their building. But the second thing is also what would be covered by this. So one of the things that emerged after the Grenfell Tower fire was that, for example, there are large numbers of buildings that have pre-existing problems that basically no one's really looked at before. And when you put up the scaffolding, when you start unscrewing the frames with the cladding on it, you really do often find lots and lots of other stuff. And one of the problems is really that if this is only going to cover the cladding costs, you might end up with a situation where people are told, don't worry, we're not going to charge you for the £10,000 for taking the cladding off your building. But by the way, you're going to have to move out for a year while we do some structural work. And that's a really serious problem. That's happened with a couple of towers in Portsmouth, where they took off the cladding and they discovered basically it's a 1960s structure underneath, where there wasn't sufficient concrete in the joists of the building, basically, and that everyone had to move out while they repaired it. These are really big risks for lots of leaseholders, and yeah.
Right. So the sum announced today is worth about £3.5 billion. There was £1.5 billion announced for a fund last year. And he made the point that these are costs that shouldn't fall on the taxpayer because, after all, there are many taxpayers who don't own flats. So how is it going to be collected, this money?
So I think one of the this is taxpayers' money, right? Is the starting point here, that the buildings will effectively be able to apply for a grant for removal and replacement of the cladding. I think it's worth bearing in mind that this is fundamentally the government's fault, though, as well. So the reason why we ended up with hundreds of thousands of people living in in buildings that we now believe never met the code is because the government was fundamentally unable to write a rule book that any builder could interpret and follow. This is the consequence both of a willingness of the building industry to cut corners where it could by a lack of interest among officials in updating guidance. They updated guidance, for example, on energy efficiency much more rigorously than they did on fire safety. And that meant that people piled ever more insulation into buildings without really thinking through what it meant for fire. It's really the government's fault. And then at the end of this, I should say, after Grenfell, they went back and decided to reinterpret their own rules on a more assiduous and rigorous basis, and then caught out all of these people in the middle of this stuff. It's absolutely, a government-caused problem, and it's absolutely right that it should be a government-funded solution.
Chris Cook, thank you very much. And the answer to that question, incidentally, is it's money for England only. So that's what covers. Well, somebody who is affected by all this is Alice Swanton. She lives in a small block of flats in Tunbridge Wells. A third of the building is covered by timber cladding. Alice, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What do you make of what you heard? How does it affect you?
To be honest with you, we're sort of together as a block on this, and we firmly believe that we've just been sort of left in a mire where, just due to the size of our building, we are going to be landed with loans that we've been given no detail on their longevity and whether they stick with the apartments themselves, and how that then affects resell. A whole myriad of questions, really.
How tall is the building?
It's just under 18 metres. I think it's 16.
OK, so you fall into the sort of second category, 4 to 6 stories.
Yes.
So what Robert Jenrick announced there was no leaseholder will ever have to pay more than £50 a month.
For cladding replacement,
right.
Yes.
And so go on. So the other ways that you are affected, are you affected in the ways that Chris was just talking about?
We're not sure, and obviously I think a lot of people are going to be sort of sitting in that boat, and we can see from the groups, the UK cladding action groups that we're involved in, that everybody's asking the same questions. Where is the detail on what this really covers? It didn't mention balconies. There was no mention of fire breaks. So we're kind of all sort of up in the air of how does this cover, and also and integrally the most important question here is, why are we having to pay just because our buildings are shorter, and some of them marginally so?
The argument put forward was that there's a lower fire risk. I mean, I can understand what you're saying about the principle. It wasn't your fault, so. But the fire risk is lower in shorter buildings.
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand that, and obviously I'm in a position where it's not looking like we're going to have absolute bankruptcy-facing charges on this building itself. But we have to. I think as a country, we all have to look into the past that has allowed these faults to happen continuously on buildings. There are still being buildings sold now that have got cladding that isn't up to the current regulation. And how many times is that regulation going to change in the next 10 years? Especially now we've got a magnifying glass on it.
How has it left you feeling?
I'm at a bit of a loss for words, to be honest with you. I'm trying my best here, but we kind of feel like we've all saved our money and done our best to, clamber onto the ladder, which isn't an easy task by any mean feat of the imagination. And now we're kind of like we're being taxed for doing so. It's
Alice.
kind of like that last step, and now we're getting knocked back off again.
Alice Swanton, thank you very much. Well, listening to that is the Conservative MP for Stevenage, Stephen McPartland. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, you tweeted just a little earlier, I'm listening to Robert Jenrick's announcement with my head in my hands, wondering how he can have got this so wrong. What has he got wrong?
Well, he was very careful to just specifically state cladding all the time. And as your two previous participants stated, it's a much bigger issue than that around fire safety defects. So the support that he's offered actually it doesn't help most people, because if people who've got waiting watchers, excessive insurance premiums, fire safety defects, that's where the real costs are, that's where the real issues are. And this is just all smoke and mirrors to basically look as though we've tried to fix the problem, but it's not going to do it.
So you say it doesn't help most people. Do you know that the scale of the problem is so much wider in most cases than just cladding?
Very much so. So effectively, the government changed the guidance. He changed the guidance in January 2020, which basically stated that any building of any height was brought into these problems. Up until then, it was only buildings over 18 metres that were affected by these problems. So any building of any height that has any issues with potential fire safety are now in a difficult position where they have to pay huge amounts of money.
What do you think the answer is? I mean, we know that developers like Persimmon, who've said this morning that they've set aside millions for the costs that they're expecting to come their way, even obviously in those houses in those blocks that they no longer own. What do you think should be happening now?
So I think there has to be a variety of things. So the first one is the taxpayer is going to have to pay up front to resolve a lot of these issues, and then try to claw the money back from developers, building owners and insurance companies. The leaseholders are the innocent parties in this. Many of these people were in primary school when these buildings were being constructed, and they're now being hit with bills that will be bankrupting them. I mean, I noticed he said something around it'd be £50 a month. That'd just be for cladding. But if that was £50,000, that £50 a month would take somebody 83 years to pay the bill off. And if it was a £50,000 bill, that's just on cladding, never mind anything else. And then on that £50,000, is that on the flat or is that on the individual? And so it just creates huge problems. And they've just never had a grip of this issue from effectively day one. They've not sat down with the people who are affected. They've not tried to work with the people campaigning on this. Great organisations, UK Cladding Action Group, End Our Cladding Scandal. These groups have been working very, very hard to try and fix these issues and come up with solutions, and they're not interested in listening to them.
You said it's clear the Prime Minister has to step in now. Seriously?
It affects up to 11 million people in this country, so seriously, yes.
What do you mean it affects 11 million people?
There's up to 11 million people living in these properties.
Right. And this is just obviously on leaseholders today.
Yeah.
And when you complain, and you've been very open with your criticism, you told the Community Secretary back in, I think it was October, to get out of his ivory tower. What's been the response from government? It's very difficult because I think, I never try to get personal. I always try to focus on the policy. But, there is incompetence at the heart of this now, and it's time to call that out. And, that's effectively what I've started to do. And that's why I think, Number 10 now has to get involved and take a grip of this situation, because it's clear the department doesn't have a grip. But should it be the developers paying for this? Or do you, like Chris Cook, think that it was down to the government regulations in the first place?
I think to resolve, the developers are going to have to contribute, so will the insurance companies and the building owners. There will be a large number of organisations that will have to contribute at some point. But if we're going to get these buildings safe, we have to identify what the problems are. The government doesn't know how many people under 11 metres, how many flats there are under 11 metres. They don't know how big the problem is.
Stephen McPartland, thank you.